I'm very pleased to share a platform with you. Your expertise and knowledge as an MEP and representing here in the West Country was very clear-cut, very obvious. And it is a tribute to all of you who are campaigning to lose your jobs. Not many people do that. So I think it's a really good occasion to try and look now at some of the reasons why I, a very convinced European, have come to the view that this is our last opportunity. I just don't believe in the referendum that we've already seen. Any Conservative government, and it looks very unlikely it would ever happen from a Labour government, will ever give us another referendum. The traumas, the, in my view, grotesque manipulation of this referendum has made it extremely unlikely that anybody is going to subject their political party to the same traumas, divisions. It's just not likely. And I think the way we will see Europe emerge in the future is through manifesto commitments. So we then need to think, about that. You get your mandate in your general election and then you do things. And I think that's how we need to look forward. And it's not a very good or present picture. Let me start just where I started. I was selected as the Labour candidate for Torrington in the summer of 1962. The first meeting I ever went to was to try and have a campaign to save Appledore Shipyard. The then Conservative Member of Parliament for that constituency was a very much loved figure called Sir Percy Brown, a farmer. And I learnt something that very first meeting. You don't have to be partisan on everything you do in politics. You can combine across party political divisions when it's necessary. And in 1975, in the referendum which we had under the Wilson government, what a different referendum that 75 referendum was to the one we're just now living with. Whatever your views, whatever your politics, this was a genuine chance to have a listen, to hear a fairly unbiased case put on both sides. And people debated amongst each other. Tony Benn went on the same television program as Roy Jenkins, and they were able to debate the issues. And Wilson said, with Callaghan as his foreign secretary, if you decide to not take our advice, and they made clear they would wish us to stay, we will implement it. Well, that's the same phraseology as David Cameron started the campaign. It's becoming harder and harder to see how he would do that. I think he must. I think his duty to stay. Maybe he'll leave politics a little earlier than he planned. But on the 24th of June, if he faces a decision, as I profoundly hope, of the British people that we are leaving, he can't cut and run the next day. After all, we are not electing a government here. That's been done a year ago. This government will run in a fixed-term parliament almost certainly to 2020. Very, very difficult to have a general election. So we are vesting in the Conservative government the responsibility for carrying out our decision. That's why this referendum is not like a general election and should not be handled like a general election. But I am a great believer in politics is don't whinge, fight. And when I heard three people who I broadly respect, though they've never been in my political party, Michael Heseltine, John Major, and William Hague, all in the space of one day, no doubt planned, telling us that if the British people voted to come out, then Scotland would separate. I decided I was not going to spend 3 months of this campaign sitting in the sun in Greece. I was going to get off my hind horse and campaign, because it is a grotesque distortion. Scottish people had their chance in a referendum, broadly fairly conducted, certainly in comparison to this one, to make their choice. And I said, and many said, and Alex Salmond said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime choice. And I say the same this time about this choice. They knew in 2014 that David Cameron had said that there would be a referendum on the question of Europe. He said it a year before. There is no question of any British government. And David Cameron knows it perfectly well, but he won't say it. They will not accept a referendum in Scotland. You don't have referendums every 2 or 3 years, just on opinion polls. If it became the very obvious, over a long period of time, wish for Scotland to leave, we would have to have a proper referendum again, one which we would all be committed to accepting the advice. So let's face what is the realities. The reality is this is a choice for all of us in the UK. The realities are we will have to accept the decision. I will accept the decision if it goes against us. So don't whinge, fight. And put the arguments in the sensible, coherent way that we've heard today about trade. I too learned something. And there is an advantage for people who have the expertise, who've lived with it day after day in the European Parliament, who've seen the distortions and the miscalculations, to listen to the objective thing. Now, it's a long time ago since I was on an election platform, in '87. It was the last time I campaigned. Reference was made to the fact that I was the EU negotiator in the former Yugoslavia for nearly 3 years. And I was well supported by the European Union. It was a very, very difficult time. I sometimes say it was my penal servitude to have to do this. But after it, I never accepted a penny from the government. I went out and earned my living in the markets of the world. I traded steel and iron ore from Russia. I was involved in the healthcare industry in the United States, and I was chairman of my own company here in the UK. And I learned one thing about trade, that the key thing is price. The next thing is design, and the third thing is to deliver at the right time. And a lot of this apparatus of trade means nothing in the real instance. You're on the end of a phone, or more importantly in these days in a computer, and the bargaining is on those 3 issues. And that is why this country has been over many centuries great traders, great world traders. And I refuse to accept that this country cannot do it again. There may be some difficulties. But also, let's face it, every action we would take would be according to the treaties. The treaty I hate most, actually, the Treaty of Lisbon, because it allows for a procedure for this country legitimately to leave the European Union. And it doesn't happen next day, or it doesn't happen next month. There's a 2-year transition, and if you have agreement, unanimous agreement, it can be extended year by year. I don't personally think that it makes any sense to have a negotiation that goes on longer than 3 years, because a year after that, we'll be into a general election. And so the British people have the right to believe that this government will honourably listen to us. If we vote to leave, that vote will have to be reflected in the British cabinet. I hear David Cameron telling us in Parliament that on day 1, I will sign the Article 50 that takes us out. No, Mr. Prime Minister. If we vote on the 23rd, the Cabinet and Parliament will decide how we handle those negotiations, not you. We've got used in this country to thinking that the Prime Minister is a president. It started under Tony Blair, and it's certainly continued under David Cameron. We appoint a Prime Minister through the process of the choice of the people of this country through their party. We elect somebody who we know is likely to be the Prime Minister if the party wins, and we expect the Prime Minister to be primus inter pares, first amongst equals, but the equals of the members of the cabinet. And I want to hear a great deal more in this country when we take back our democracy, when we take back our parliamentary democracy, that we have cabinets that work. How did Attlee handle the cabinet? How did even Margaret Thatcher handle the cabinet? It's a new issue, this question of prime ministerial government. And I want to restore the full measure of parliamentary democracy that we've had in the past. When the Chilcot report comes out about the mess that we got ourselves into in Iraq and Afghanistan, it will reveal, above all, not the vindictive against the people who that, it will show that our structure of government, our democratic government, broke down, and we want to never see that happen again. Come back with me to Appledore in 1962. Some of you have been there. Lovely little village, you go down a steep hill down to the bottom, and there's a fantastic port. In 1962, it was packed with fishing boats. It historically has been one of the great fishing ports of this country through the centuries. A few weeks ago, the last fishing vessel, the Hannah Marie, was shipped across the seas to Denmark. And the whole of the ray fishing industry, which is in the Bristol Channel, has dramatically changed. They're still fishing for them in Milford Haven. But where do the majority of the boats come from? Belgium. You saw that tragic figure. Unbelievably moving, I thought, to watching those small numbers of boxes and realizing the hardship that has hit the fishing industry, and you can still see it if you go to Grimsby or you go up through the coast right through to Scotland. I remember in 1992, I always get my years wrong, so I'm sure I'm wrong on that, 1972, I'm allowed a few licenses now at the great age of 77, going to Norway at the express invitation of the Prime Minister of Norway, because he wanted a young Labour person to go and argue why they should join the European Union. And sitting on the same platform with me, it was a man I'd much admired, Willy Brandt, who has been the mayor of Berlin in all those difficult years and the Chancellor of Germany, and had spent times in Norway, exiled, self-exiled, because of him being a social democrat from Germany and Norway. And you know, I suddenly realized I was in the wrong meeting. The hostility of the Norwegian people to this young pup from UK coming and telling them what they should do, but even more, it was felt about Willy Brandt. And I spent the whole time saying, of course, I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm not here to tell you how to vote. After saying it about 5 times, somebody said from the back of the hall, well, why the hell are you here? Now, one of the more unattractive aspects of this referendum is the number of people who from foreign countries have come and told us how to deal with it. And I don't know about you, but when Boris Johnson took on President Obama, I was pretty pleased. Now, you know, Debbie, many of you in this hall know her. She's American. And she's an Obama mama. She supports everything he does, and she's a great supporter. But when she heard him say, "You'll be at the back of the queue," like a good American, she laughed and laughed and laughed. Because in America, you're at the back of the line. And she knew then that that speech, those sentiments had been direct from number 10, direct from Cameron. Come and help me in this crisis. And when you were puzzled why all these heads of government and all these people pile in from the international body, you have to understand it. It's the world I used to live in as Foreign Secretary. There's a trade union of heads of governments and foreign secretaries. You work together, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And basically you don't interfere in other people's countries unless they ask you to, beg you to come into them. And that's why you're meeting this thing. To actually get up and say, Britain should leave, you wouldn't necessarily be insulting the Prime Minister of this country, you'd be having problems with the other 27 members of the European Union. So this is actually a moment to put that whole thing in their perspective. They're coming here often to protect their own interests. And I think we need to take this into account. And just for a short time, I'll deal with fishing and then I'll try and deal with a few other issues. Because I think it is important to remember, we're pretty fortunate here in Plymouth. The ups and downs of our fishing industry have been tragic to watch. But there have been ups, and we're in an up phase now, and we've got an extremely efficient industry in this city of Plymouth, and with some very considerably talented people who've invested and made it successful. But how much more successful it could be if we were outside the EU. Now, nothing is going to totally change. You know, we have traditional fishing rights with France going back centuries, and other countries too. Although it's tempting to think of the map, that we'll have 200 miles of water all around the island suddenly returned to us, no, it won't be like that. We have to work within international agreements and arrangements. We all know that the fishing industry is very delicately balanced, and if anybody goes out there without some form of overall sustainability, we'll outfish and then we'll get nothing. I see that in my house in Greece, where I fish these days more than I used to do in the Plymouth Sound. And we've fished out large parts of the Mediterranean, sadly. So we can't, and on conservation too, and young people desperately interested in this whole industry. How do we deal with whales? What do we do with the shark industry? There's a whole real commitment to trying to protect and conserve the seas. And we have to work internationally on that. But the difference, the thing to understand, is that Britain will be there as of right managing quite substantially parts of this international agreements. The whole thing will be different. And slowly and steadily we can get better deals, fairer deals. I've put out a lot of the detail of all this, but I'm not going to weary you with that. But it is very important for the fishing industry that they should know that some of us understand the complexities and the problems of it. But we here have one duty, which is to stand by this industry, which was one of the great industries of the West Country, and say to our people here, this is one thing that is dramatically going to change down here in the West Country. This isn't an idle promise. It will take a few years to build back, take a little time, but you will start to see a fishing industry that we can remember, and it will be right around our coasts. It will change, and it will change positively for the better. And some of us remember the extraordinary way in which the common fishery policy was imposed. The day before we started the negotiations, they suddenly took, without any warning whatever, all the fishing in the European waters suddenly became a common fishing policy. And we had to negotiate against that. Now, I know there's a great deal of bitterness about that negotiation, but it was a very difficult negotiation. I don't often say much in support of the Ted Heath government, but they basically decided to write it off. They knew they couldn't achieve anything. And another British Prime Minister has written off the fishing industry. Did you hear anything from David Cameron in his so-called renegotiation that affected the fishing industry? Not one little bit. It was given up completely. There is only one way you can restore the fishing industry, and that is to vote out. I don't say this should be the only issue. Even I, that love the National Health Service and appalled what has happened to the National Health Service, and watched as the European Union, particularly since about 2002, began to get more and more involved. And the reason? We decided to marketize the National Health Service. We decided to, not me personally, but the government of the day. I accepted. I'm a Democrat. They won elections. They were able to make these changes to the National Health Service. But there's one thing I cannot accept, that you can never reverse it. And I tell you, you will not go back. to the great vision of Aneurin Bevan and the National Health Service that came into this country in 1948, unless you win back the power to make decisions in a British Parliament. And this is what's changed. Barbara Castle said to me in the 1975 referendum, she was my boss. We had different views about politics. She was further on the left than I was. Though I must say, I now find myself further on the left than the mainstream of the Labour Party, but that's another thing. But she said to me, David, this common market will eventually penetrate the National Health Service. These common market rules will stop. I just scoffed it. I said, Barbara, you're grotesquely exaggerating. Nothing will happen. And nothing did happen until the license for it came from within our own political system. Okay, that's right. But you see this happening and this new treaty they're trying to agree. Do you realize that this commission negotiated year on in the so-called TTIP with the United States? Nobody knew what was going on. No governments really knew what was going on. The commissioner held it entirely within this secret negotiation, and then we suddenly discovered that the health and the National Health Service would be covered by it. They're denying it at their peril, but they're still denying it. One of the great things that's happened in this campaign so far is that Conservative MPs, who not before really focused on this issue, have begun to read the treaty and see some of the impact of it. And so we had a resolution on Monday in the House of Lords, carried unanimously, regretting that there was no bill to deal with the problems of the National Health Service in the TTIP. Of course, they didn't believe a word of it, but it was with Conservative votes. Without them, we would never have been able to get that agreement. And the same thing happened in the House of Commons a few days later. And that's one of the advantages of this type of campaign. When you meet on platforms, you meet to share views, you begin to understand some of the positions of the other people. And there are Tory MPs that have said to me, we defend what we're doing on the National Health Service, but we defend your right, if you get a Labour government back again, to change it back if you wish to. That is the essence of our democracy. Go on allowing the European community to go into every nook and cranny. I was very struck when you said how we used to have 2 commissioners out of 13, and one of those was in the second tier underneath the president of the commission. I was struck by that film. I was the one who wanted you to see it, because when I watched it, I said, I thought I knew a lot about the European Union. I learned a great deal about it through that film, and there's more to come if you want to listen at the end. Now, I'm one of those people, and some of you know it, I'm sometimes called a moderate. I'm not altogether sure that's an appropriate way of describing my attitude to the reforms of the National Health Service, but put it on one side. But I do believe this, that it's very rare that any real issue worth arguing can be won 100 to 1, 100 to naught. It's usually, you're doing well to win 60 to 40, and you well have to settle 55 to 45. I mean, this is the way these things happen. And what I dislike about the whole of this debate that's been going on is this granting of a referendum, getting it right to the point where you're actually starting the referendum campaign, and then suddenly you're told there's no argument. It would create Third World War, all in the headlines of the newspapers, not said by the Prime Minister next day, but anticipated in all what he said, implying that. This is bogus nonsense, and we in this city know it better than anywhere else. The thing that has saved us from the Third World War was the decision actually in 1946 of President Truman to cancel the decision to bring the US troops back from Europe, change his mind very visibly, and take on his critics in the country and say they've got to stay. What was emerging in the Soviet Union under Stalin was threatening and dangerous, and he started to keep them there. And then there were the achievement of NATO, 2 great statesmen, one of them General Marshall, who had been the real man behind the US military drive, staying close to the President Franklin Roosevelt, giving up the chance of military command in the field, which every general wants. And we had a similar man in Alan Brooke, Viscount Alan Brooke, as later named, who stayed with Churchill all through the war, and like a good, tough Northern Irishman, argued with Churchill in 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. Now that man Marshall was matched on the British side by Ernie Bevan, a remarkable man who was born, actually, illegitimate in Somerset, and one of the greatest political figures this country, in my view, has ever had. And I say to you, they built NATO. And that is the finest military alliance that anywhere in the world has seen. Remember, when the League of Nations broke down, it broke down because Woodrow Wilson couldn't convince Congress that he could commit to real serious peacekeeping, because they would not accept that there could be control of their forces by anything other than the president. NATO overcame that. NATO gave us Article 5, which allows us to go to war to save the member states if their independence is threatened and challenged. And I say to you, to try and pretend that the European Union has been the thing that sacrificed and made great strains. We paid 9% of our GDP towards defense after that war, when we were still extremely weak. All through the 50s and 60s, we held serious forces, which made it possible for NATO. We're not going to be told now that the saving of the war, of the Third World War, by a person who wasn't even a boy during it. And then I heard from the Prime Minister the use of the word moral. Now, we all know what happens. You brief moral, but the reverse of it is immoral. That's the point I can't take any longer. I'm not prepared to take that those of us who wish to leave the European Union at this stage are immoral. So let's take the emotion out and let's look at some of the issues. The thing that changed Europe for me, and I was a strong supporter of it, and I don't deny it, were two things. This young doctor who knew nothing about politics in 1962 heard the then leader of my party, the Labour Party, Hugh Gateskill, spell out for the first time to the British people, first on television and then to a Labour Party conference. He said, European unity is a good thing. This is a man who was Chancellor of Exchequer in the Attlee government. European unity is a good thing. But, he said, if it means the emergence of a United States of Europe, where Britain is just a province, like, say, California or Florida in the United States, then I am opposed to it. He said it is possible for it to emerge without that. It can be a manifestation of working together as good neighbors, as Europeans. But it holds within it, because he talked to the people who are designing it, in the founding fathers, Monet, the Frenchman, Spark, and others. And he warned us. And that's why I have never shifted from believing that we are not prepared as a country to join a federalist union. When I became a young Foreign Secretary in 1977, Jim Callaghan sent me a note. He said, we're going to have a one-day cabinet meeting, and I want you to write the papers, not the diplomats. I want this to be a gathering of Labour Party people who can decide how we're going to handle this and spread it down through the government. And it was a commitment to be good Europeans, but an absolute rejection of federalism. So I don't say this to say I have not changed my mind. If the facts change, I change. But I have never believed and have never preached and have never argued here in this city, ever, for a federalist Europe. And what changed was when we decided to create a currency in 1990. And from that moment on, and with Janet, an extremely able and effective director of the New Europe, we opposed the possibility that we would have a Eurozone referendum in 2003 on what in 2002 they were calling in Downing Street the back of a Baghdad bounce. Well, tragically, we had no success in Baghdad in 2003, and we still haven't now. I'm not going into that whole issue, except to say there was a very real threat that Tony Blair would have called a Eurozone referendum on joining the Euro in 2003, and it was vital that some people on a cross-party basis got together and we campaigned with Business for Sterling, and the argument was yes to Europe, no to the Euro. And why? Because it is the founding element of a United States of Europe. You cannot have a single currency without a single country. I profoundly ask you to look at that. Look at the history. Charlemagne, the first empire that they tried to build in Europe, they had a currency. It collapsed. There's history pages are written about creating currency unions across a number of countries. And there's an end result. They either merge or the currency fails. Look at how America, how long in time they took to develop a single currency. Over centuries. They had dollars with different denominations in different states. They had a civil war in order to create the United States of America. Now, I think we've got to be aware of these facts. There is no appetite, it seems to me, on any opinion poll you look at, in the British people to go into the United States of Europe. And I don't believe that this is prejudiced or bigoted or any unpatriotic or any of this stuff. It's just, we know what we love. We know that we have built a democracy here that works. We lived for years, some of us, waiting for our party to have power. We do eventually have an alternation of power. And on balance, you get it right. I've been kicked out of government twice. 1970 and in 1979. I didn't appreciate it at the time, I want to make it quite clear. But it wasn't more than a few weeks when I began to ponder, well, maybe the electorate got it right. Think of that great victory for Labour in 1945. Nobody predicted it. Some people thought they might scrape home, but massive majority. And I will rejoice in it. And I think most fair-minded people believe, they didn't necessarily like it, didn't think a lot of it, but that it was a democratic expression and a legitimate, radical change of direction in many respects. And I think the same thing happened in '79. I think the country did see that the trade union power had to be dealt with. I think they did see that we had to earn our living in the markets of the world, and we had to be more competitive, and we had to be more effective and efficient. I never liked the Tory government, but I think it's part of the general British tradition that when I now go in through the lobby of the House of Commons from time to time, I'm not a great attender, I have to tell you, in the House of Lords, which I consider rather illegitimate since you're not elected. But when I go now back into that lobby, if you walk into the actual chamber, there's Winston Churchill and there's David Lloyd George, which with Welsh heritage I respect, so conservative and liberal. But as you walk in from the House of Lords and Central Lobby, you have Clement Attlee, who's been there on the pedestal for quite some time, and now you have Margaret Thatcher. We have a way of tolerating political differences. We have a way of living together with alternation of power, and it suits us, and I think it's given us prosperity, I think it's helped to give us peace, and I think it's helped to give us unity in difficult times. And I think it's precious. And I believe it's challenged. And I believe it's challenged in an extremely profound way. So I am happy to speak on this platform. When I used to say to Debbie when this referendum was first announced, and I deplored both the manner in which it was announced, and I deplored the timetable in which it was given, and a variety of things. And I fought for the last 5 years, writing books, going around Europe, trying to get them to understand They can keep Europe united if you give up freedom of movement of labor inside the single market. You don't need it in the single market. It's another of these pressures for a United States of Europe. You need a single market, you need a freedom of movement of labor and people in a Eurozone, in a currency union, and you need it in a United States of Europe, but you don't need it in a trade agreements and in the single market. But by forcing it in, refusing to change, it has made it inevitable. We have to withdraw and find new markets, not within the framework of the single market legislation. But as you heard today, the idea that they're going to suddenly stop all trade is perfect. It's asinine, actually, completely ridiculous. What politicians are sent there to do is to look after the best interests of their country. Can you really see a German chancellor suddenly saying that they will have to face either tariffs or obstacles to selling cars into this country? You know, walk around the street, see where the cars are. And the same thing happens to France. We buy more champagne, I think, than almost any other country in the world per head. Well, we're doing quite well with our own wine industry, and it's got bubbles in it. And if we're outside the EU, we'll be able to call it champagne. And and we're also, our cheese industry is doing frightfully well. We don't call it camembert, we have to call it something else. But we will start calling it camembert, and we will start calling it a few other French names. Now, we're not going back to that sort of world. I say it as a joke. We aren't prepared to do that, and they're not fools. We will form a bilateral trade agreement. It may not be quite as advantageous in some respects, but we don't want it to be, because we want the freedom to be able to go out and create different markets. So I say to these people who perpetrate fear, I was very pleased to see the other day that one of the external advisors to the governor of the Bank of England broke ranks. It was in the Times on Thursday. And this man said, the governor rather unadvisedly said, you know, that we'd be at the mercy of strangers as to whether or not we'd be accepted. He said his experience was that in the arrangements, they made their own decisions. And he said, this country is highly investable, whether you're in or out of the euro. And I thought to myself, at long last, an honest man. And so I end tonight emotionally and happily in this city which I was born and love. It's not easy, these choice. It's not easy for the average person to sort it out. And I began to wonder what was going to happen. Well, we spent a couple of hours down on the sundial issuing leaflets for this campaign. And many people came up to me who I knew, I recognized. And it was extraordinary, really, in just such a short time to meet 5 or 6 people I actually knew, but lots more who knew me. And I'm not doing a count, I'm not predicting the results of the election. But the thing that I liked about it was just in these short exchange of views, people had seen through all this fear stuff. There was a real sense of up yours, you know, they weren't taking it. Now I hope this isn't just a West Country spirit, because we're fighters here. We're merchant adventurers. We've tamed the seas, we've sailed the seas, we've fought our battles. I believe it's the spirit of the British people. And I profoundly hope we have the courage of our convictions on the 23rd, and we vote to keep our country, to keep it, and to sustain it.